Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Greater Lynn. I'm Chris Scheller, Minister of Community Life and Learning here, and we are very delighted to be offering this presentation. This is brought to you by the Swampscott Conservancy, UUCGL, and the Clifton Improvement Association, which we can call the CIA. So this program, we like to do this kind of thing. We like to offer programs, especially environmental justice, social justice, of course, spiritual practices, and you can check out our website, uucgl.org, for more information. And we also like to partner with other organizations that have like-minded goals. And so we've got the Swampscott Conservancy, which is an all-volunteer nonprofit in Swampscott, working to understand and respond to dealing with preservation and protection of the environment, hiking trails, native plant gardens, hiking and biking events, talks ranging from coyotes to eelgrass to rat poison, and you can become a member at swampscottconservancy.org. And the Clifton Improvement Association, now from this point on known as the CIA, is registered nonprofit, also made up of volunteers to preserve and protect and improve the historical and natural character of local open and public spaces through information, education, and advocacy. And they own and maintain Beach Bluff Park in Swampscott by Preston Beach, which I have not yet been to, but I've made a promise. I know I didn't promise a particular time that I would get there by, but they host a sun circle with ceremonies for spring, summer, fall, and winter solstices and equinox, and you can check out ciabeachbluff.org for more information on them. We're all going to partner again together to host Tailwinds, which is kind of dovetails with this, if you will, because they will have a presentation on live native raptors like hawks and owls, and because of the live animals will be in the parish hall next door. And that's November 29th at 6:30. Our speaker tonight, Laura Kiesel, is an academically trained wildlife biologist and a naturalist, conservation advocate, and award-winning environmental journalist. Her bylines have appeared in Salon, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, Earth Island Journal, Science, Inside Climate News, and The Atlantic, among others. And she is the founder of Save Arlington Wildlife, which advocates for restrictions to dangerous rodenticides and seeds grassroots campaigns focusing on the issue in communities around Massachusetts. So let's give a warm welcome to Laura.
Well, one, thank you for having me. Thank you to the Swampscott Conservancy and the Clifton Improvement Association. I really appreciate you having me tonight on this very cold night. Just so that people know a little bit about me and how I got involved in this. So, well, one, I grew up in New York City. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I grew up in a really dense inner city neighborhood. Actually, it was a very low income neighborhood, and I was very starved from a young age for green spaces, wildlife. That's something I always wanted to have more exposure to. And likewise, my neighborhood was back then and still is an environmental justice community, which means because it was low income, because it was disproportionately a community of color, there were a lot of industrial facilities that were located there, meaning we had a lot of pollution. And so rates of asthma were high, rates of cancer were high, like this included my own family living there. And so from a very young age, I had a very heightened sense of like justice and injustice and what it means when there are chemicals polluting an area and how it impacts not just the animals or the lack thereof, but like people's health too. I got my bachelor's degree in literature and journalism, and I went to SUNY New Paltz, which is in the Hudson Valley region, so that was really my first taste of more natural landscape. And later on, I moved to Amherst, Massachusetts, and I decided to start pursuing studies in wildlife biology because UMass Amherst actually has one of the best wildlife conservation biology programs in the country. And for several years I did that, and I was actually training to become a wolf biologist. And I also, in between pursuing my studies, I did several fellowships and internships with different conservation organizations, including the National Wildlife Federation. I actually was in Washington, D.C. during the administration of George W. Bush, and my internship was public lands advocacy and protecting the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and almost every week we were like they were trying to drill it, there was another bill that was being introduced. So I got a crash course in political lobbying, and also I was already kind of a cynical person, but I got to really affront kind of like this front seat view to like the influence that industries can have on our elected officials, because I would see like people from the fossil fuel industry coming to talk to like these elected representatives about why they needed to drill the Arctic refuge. I also lived and worked in Alaska for a time on a fellowship looking at the way climate change was impacting the wildlife and oil and gas development there. And I've worked a bunch of other jobs in environmental, for different environmental agencies or organizations, either as an employee or an independent contractor or consultant over the years. And I finally finished my degree about 2009 at the University of Vermont in Natural Resources. And did you get it? Is it work? Oh, wow. What do you mean? Okay, how do I get it on slideshow here? Do you know what I'm saying? How do I start it? Start it as the presentation. Present, right? I didn't even need you for that part. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for your patience while we figured that part out. So it doesn't advance. Oh. So I'm sorry, how do I do that? Please stay on the line. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Sorry, it's very complicated. I have two different screens I have to go back and forth between. So I got my degree in natural resources, sciences, and policy, and I've been doing a lot of environmental journalism. And I came to this issue because I was living in the town of Arlington. At the time, I was living in affordable housing because journalism does not pay well. And one day I was coming out of my building, and there was a pest control person there, and he was laying down like 20 bait stations. No one knew what these were. This was like back in 2015. They weren't ubiquitous the way they were today. Like Arlington at the time was getting ready for a big construction project called the Mass Ave project. The whole avenue for several miles was getting torn up in a couple of months. And so what happened was a lot of the landlords and property owners in that area were very worried about rats because of the construction, and they were told, go to a pest control company, and all of a sudden, within a matter of months, we went from having none of these bait stations to them mushrooming all over my town. And with my building, I was the only one who knew what was in this and what their impacts were. The landlords did not know. And I would literally stand there in front of the landlords, explain the impacts, say if anything eats a rodent that eats these poisons, whether it be my cats or some of the red-tailed hawks that are nesting nearby, they could die. And I would say, I've studied wildlife biology, I'm degreed in environmental science, and the pest control person would say, she's lying, she doesn't know what she's talking about. And they would look at me and say, well, like, they're the professionals, so they would know. And so I was hitting a lot of walls at that time, and it was very frustrating. And obviously now we're seeing a lot of the fallout that I was very afraid we'd start seeing, which is a lot of wildlife deaths, including some very high-profile wildlife deaths of some very sensitive species, including bald eagles. So let's see if I can do this. Okay. Sorry, it's a little tricky because I have to make both screens move at different times. So I like to start off with a quote from Rachel Carson. The public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road, and it can only do so when in full possession of the facts. Despite my degree and my professional background, I actually didn't read Silent Spring until a few years ago, and I was really struck by how much of the themes of it were resonant to this issue and to what we're dealing with today. So just to give a little bit of background about the issue. So this was my first article that I wrote about it. So when I was hitting all these walls as a citizen, I decided, okay, well, my training is as a journalist. I'm going to kind of marry my biologist training and my journalism training, and I'm going to start following this issue as a reporter when I can. And this was my first piece that was published in 2018, and it was in Dig Boston at the time. And I do actually have that anecdote about me coming out one day and seeing the pest control person in front of my building and saying like that it's fine, it's not going to hurt anybody, any animals. This is so tricky. And this was my second piece that was published in the end of 2021. It was also published initially in Dig Boston, but then it was also syndicated as a top story in Salon. It was also nominated and was a top 5 finalist for the David Carr Award of Investigative Reporting. So this was a much more in-depth feature than my first piece for Dig Boston. And this was after Arlington lost our first bald eagle in 2021. So I decided to do a lot more digging into like the pest control industry and into the EPA and a lot of those other parts of the story that I feel like a lot of media was not paying attention to. So I'm going to clarify a little bit. There are many different types of rat poisons and rodenticides, but the ones that I'm mostly going to be talking about tonight are anticoagulant rodenticides, and in particular the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. Even though I've been doing this for years, I still have problems pronouncing these, so I don't want to go through all the names, but Brodifacoum, and those other ones as well. Brodifacoum is actually the deadliest one that you may hear about the most. There are also first-generation anticoagulant rodenticides. Those are problematic as well, but they do not work up the food chain quite as aggressively as SGARs do. And SGARs are the acronym that I'll be using tonight to refer to these poisons. Oh, I just got off the screen. There we go. And this is a little sheet I came upon that I think shows some of the different kinds of rodenticides, both the FGARs and the SGARs, and there are a couple of others, including bromethalin, which is not an anticoagulant rodenticide. It's a neurotoxin, but it has also been causing some wildlife casualties, including of a bald eagle recently in Massachusetts, so I just did want to mention that in passing, since that is also emerging as a rodenticide to be concerned about. And to let you know, as the name states, anticoagulant rodenticide means that it inhibits vitamin K in the body, which means the blood cannot coagulate or clot. So a lot of these animals wind up hemorrhaging to death. Like they could do something as simple as sneeze or cough, and they'll get these massive internal hemorrhages because their body has no clotting factor, because that's how these poisons work, by inhibiting the clotting factor. So I just completely lost the screen up here. I'm sorry, this is awkward for me to have to keep looking behind me as I do this. So I want to talk a little bit about bald eagles, just so people understand the context, because I think a lot of people have come to this issue, especially in the past year or two, because they've heard about the bald eagle deaths in Massachusetts. And I think besides the obvious fact that bald eagles are the symbol of our nation, so people have a lot of sentimental or strong feelings about bald eagles, is also just that we almost already lost them last century, and now they seem to be a species that are particularly vulnerable to this kind of poisoning. So bald eagles were pretty much wiped out of Massachusetts in the 1960s, and most of the country, and because of another type of pesticide, which was the DDT, right, that Rachel Carson spoke about. And in the early 1970s, when the Endangered Species Act was established, the bald eagle was one of the first species that was listed. And they were federally endangered until 2007. However, they're still listed in Massachusetts. So many states, I think like 46 states, have their own endangered species lists, because even federally, if they may be doing okay, maybe in the specific state they're not. So bald eagles were actually threatened in Massachusetts until I think it was 2021, and almost immediately after they were demoted from threatened status to species of special concern, we had several bald eagles die of these poisonings. And I'm not saying it's because of that, because they had special protections they lost, but just to show that they're barely recovering and they're already backsliding in terms of the risks they're facing. And so they're still listed as a species of special concern in Massachusetts, and there are about 80 pairs in the state. And so this eagle, this is in Waltham. So this was the first bald eagle that died of confirmed Escar's poisoning, which means the state actually did a necropsy, did a liver, autopsied the liver and found lethal levels of Escar's poisoning. This was a picture my friend Margaret Lewis took on the left. You see she's so beautiful. She took that, and this was a week later or something, or less than 2 weeks later. Here is someone who's removing her dead from the nest. Now, she was found dead on top of her unhatched eggs, so she was incubating eggs. So those eggs did not obviously get incubated, these also disrupt breeding cycles as well, these poisons, even for the animals they are not outright killing, which I'll get into a little bit more. But I do want to say that even though this was the first formally confirmed bald eagle to have died, that back in 2018, around the same time I was writing my first article, Cape Wildlife Center actually had another eagle that they were pretty sure also had Escar's poisoning. It was doing that thing where it was coughing up watery blood. When they took a blood draw, it was not clotting. And I don't remember if they tried to get a necropsy independently, but because it was not tagged or tracked by the state, I think it was a migrant, meaning it came from another state and it was found on Cape Cod, and so the state officials were not tracking it. They did not do a formal necropsy. But this also begs the question of how many other animals might have died that we're just not counting in our censuses, because this one wasn't counted as the first bald eagle to die in Massachusetts, even though it seems it did die of Escar's poisoning. Now this is, sorry, I have to catch up with the other screen. So that is C25. So that is MK the eagle. Has everyone heard of MK the eagle, who I'll talk about in a minute? That's one of my photos of her. So this was her offspring. So MK and her mate, KZ, started nesting in Arlington in 2021. Like I said, this is around the same time they were demoted from species of special concern to threatened status. And MK and KZ were the first mated pair of bald eagles to nest in Arlington in like 60 or 70 years, since DDT wiped them out of our state. And this was their first offspring that they had in Arlington. I think they did try, they were nesting, I think, in Winchester the year before, and they had one nestling, and she was predated upon. So these were her first viable offspring, were in Arlington. C25 and C26 were their names because the state officials did tag them. And so this is the first glimpse I got of C25. She looks like she's from out of a Jim Henson movie, like The Dark Crystal or something. It was so thrilling for me to see her peek her head up. And so I basically spent a lot of time that summer. I would do it during off-peak hours because I didn't want to crowd them. But I spent a lot of time monitoring the nest, of course, because I was terrified, because I was noticing that there were, this is a cemetery that is just surrounded by businesses and large apartment complexes that had bait boxes with Escars in them all over. And so this was a picture I took of C25 a couple of months later. This was on 4th of July, 2021. I figured it was a pretty holiday appropriate thing on the 4th of July to go see the bald eagle nest. And as you can see, she's a lot bigger here. She was fledgling stage. She was already like leaving the nest on her own, but kind of staying pretty close to it. And I don't know if you can see it. It's really hard to tell, but you may notice there's these like green-looking flecks on her wingtips. Now, what happens is these baits, these escar's baits, they're like usually bright blue or green, like phosphorescent blue or green to signify poison. But what happens is this color actually dyes the intestinal tracts of the rodents, and there have been pictures online that show when a bird of prey is, disemboweling one of these rodents, that you can see the green and blue. And so this day that I was watching her on the nest, I watched their mom bring a large dead rat, and I saw them eating it, and then I was like, am I seeing things? Is this an optical illusion, or is that like green splatter from the bait of the rat she's eating? This was the last time I saw C25 alive, because a few weeks later she was found. She was found, first she was like on a low branch, which is unlike them in the middle of the day, and she was like drooping her head and her talon was dangling down. And then she fell face down on the grass. And so someone called our animal control officer, and she came and brought C25 to Tufts. So this was the last picture taken of C25 alive. She arrived that afternoon to Tufts Wildlife Clinic, and she died not even 2 hours later. And they did have a necropsy, as they did with the bald eagle in Waltham, and they confirmed that it was also escar's poisoning. And I want to say that the eagle populations are still in such a state of recovery that the Waltham eagle and C25, as far as people know, are cousins. So they were relatives of each other, because MK was actually born in Waltham. So this is from, I think this is a Boston Globe article to show that this was the second bald eagle that died in Massachusetts in 5 months. And what didn't get reported is that C26, her sibling, actually was also showing signs of escar's poisoning. It wasn't ever confirmed, but there was some intervention kind of done a little bit off the books with her, or else I think she would have died as well. So, and this is my photo of MK that I took. This is the first time I ever spotted MK. This was a few months before all of this happened in April 2021. This is her on the Mystic Lake, when I think her babies were still either in eggs or just had hatched. And, so I still monitored the nest. The following summer, she had 2 more offspring. They did not succumb to poisoning. But this past March, as people probably know, MK then started showing signs of rodenticide poisoning. She was found on the ground at dusk. They're diurnal predators, meaning they do not hunt at night. So to see a diurnal predator, a bird of prey, on the ground at twilight is not a good thing. And she was shuffling around, acting very disoriented. So she was scooped up and brought to the New England Wildlife Center. These were the pictures that were taken of her. It was very upsetting for a lot of us who were monitoring it. And she did survive the first night, and a lot of us actually did start to have hope that perhaps she would pull through. But she died the second night, and it was of a massive internal hemorrhage. She coughed, and basically she had a hemorrhage, I think, in her digestive tract from that. And that's basically textbook escar's poisoning. And they did do blood draws as well, and the blood just never clotted. Why is this not? And this is not a Massachusetts own specific thing. This is something that's happening all across the country at different levels. But there was a study that came out, I believe this was in 2021, so around the same time I saw MK, only a few months before C25 died. This was a big bombshell study that was released that found that 80% of bald and golden eagles that they surveyed from all different carcasses found across the country had high levels of escar's exposure. Now this is actually a clip, but I don't want to play it because I'm so worried with the technological issues we're having tonight that would just cause complete chaos. But I was very upset when MK died. I wanted to do something. At this point, we lost C25. We also lost an entire family of great horned owls, which I'm going to speak about in a second. And it was clear that people needed to have a channel for their rage, their mourning. So I announced on Facebook that I was going to hold a vigil and a march in MK's memory the day after she died, and also to demand that political leaders take action on this issue. And this was less than 24 hours notice, and I was really surprised. It was early March. It was still very cold out. As you can see how people are dressed, there's still snow on the ground. Over 300 people showed up to that rally. In Arlington, we started out on one of the town greens, and we held candles, and we basically had a session of like sort of mourning and remembrance, and then we marched to the town hall where I and several other people, including Representative Sean Garbely, said a few words about like next steps we could take. But that it was also, I think, one of the first times I also started to have hope that maybe more things could be done, because it was clear that MK was a galvanizing figure on this issue, to have so many people show up like that. And I know that a lot of people did a lot of follow-up actions as well after that. But I do want to point out that it is not just eagles that are vulnerable. I mean, it runs across a whole bunch of species, but birds of prey are especially susceptible to Escar's poisoning because they do rely just so heavily on rodents as part of their diet, especially eagles, red-tailed hawks, and great horned owls. So this is a family of great horned owls that started nesting in our park in 2021. This is a mother and her 2 fledgling offspring. And again, similar to with MK and her nest, I would watch it, monitor it, come a few times a week. I'd go there. I was very worried because it's a very dense part of the town. It's only like less than a half a mile from the Arlington Center with all the shops, which have a lot of bait boxes. And then they found first the mom, and then only about 6 or 7 feet away from her, they found one of the fledgling. Now, they were not formally tested because the state does not formally test animals that are not under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. And what the problem is that then, unfortunately, like that ignorance gets exploitive of like, well, you don't know if it was Escar's poisoning. You're not, we don't know. It could be many other things. And that's true, but with these 2, they had watery blood. They had coughed up. They were, the ACO actually did cut them open post-mortem, and they were still spilling out very bright red, watery blood. Blood is supposed to clot post-mortem. It's not supposed to run out like Kool-Aid. So that's usually a pretty strong telltale sign that it is Escar's poisoning. And then, so great horned owls, like many birds of prey, they mate for life. And they can live, in theory, up to 30 years or more sometimes. Uh-oh. I think my computer just froze because I'm not. Oh, okay, so great. Thanks. So when the mom, like I said, this mom and her fledgling died, and then only a few days later, the 3rd fledgling was found dead as well. And I'm not sure if that fledgling died because of Escar's poisoning or if it was because the mother had died and hadn't fed it, because usually the male owl will help with parenting duties, but he can't do it alone. So I'm not sure how the 3rd one died, though I think there were also some signs. But it was very sad because for the next like 6-7 months, my partner and I would go at dusk or twilight to the park, and the male owl would just be hooting a lot alone, because for those of who may be familiar with great horned owls, they do this duet at night where they sing back and forth and they come close. It's like this really beautiful balletic display that they'll do, and he would do it all alone and there'd be no rejoinder. But then at the end of November last year, we were thrilled because he had attracted another mate, because we didn't want him to be alone. Like, their natural instinct is to be paired, is to be mated. So he attracted a female mate, and me and the other Arlington residents were very excited and celebrated. And then 2 weeks later, she was found on the ground coughing up watery blood. This was a picture, the ACO, but at that time she was no longer the ACO, but she has a lot of contacts with wildlife rehabbers, so she and a wildlife rehabber came, picked her up, took this picture. She was still alive when this picture was taken, but she died in the car en route to the wildlife clinic. So this time, me and a bunch of other citizens crowdfunded, and we got her body sent to a lab because we did not want people telling us, no, that it might not be poison. So the necropsy was performed, and yes, it was Escar's poisoning that definitively killed her. And it also lends more credibility that it was likely Escar's poisoning that killed the other owls in that park as well. And I just want to say as an update that male owl did find another mate a couple of months later, but they did not have offspring that year. So again, as I mentioned before, even when it's not killing these animals, it's disrupting their breeding cycles, and they're not having babies those years. And that makes it worse for people who care about rodents, because if a single owl can kill and consume thousands of rodents in a year, and obviously if you have a whole family of owls, you're talking 5, 6, 7,000 rats and mice that are now going to be in the environment because you have now extirpated that nest from that area. Also around the same time, I'm sorry, I think this is slowing down my presentation a little to do this, so I apologize. I just saw it. There it is. Around the same exact time that the female owl was found, a Cooper's hawk was also found dead in someone's backyard. And that was also a Cooper's hawk, I'm pretty sure, because it was in the exact same area of a nest that I had been monitoring for several months. Cooper's hawks, that's when it was still in a nest. That was them when they were fledgling. There were actually 4 or 5 of them, and then that was the one that was found dead. And similarly to the owl, we crowdfunded and had it sent into a lab where it did confirm very high lethal levels of Escar's poisoning. And what's notable about the Cooper's hawk, I almost didn't include this slide, is a lot of people think that Cooper's hawks are not going to be as susceptible because they primarily kill songbirds rather than rodents. And well, one, I think that we're overstating or understating what their prey are. But there's also been some research that shows that house sparrows and other animals, we don't even really realize it, are getting into those bait boxes and eating that bait. So this Cooper's hawk could have gotten it, of course, from rodents, or it could have potentially actually eaten sparrows or something that had this poison in their system. And the poison that looks like killed this Cooper's hawk is one called bromadiolone. And I wanted to point that out too really quickly because a lot of pest control people have been selling that lately to people, saying it's one of the least dangerous Escars. And I even have the city of New York that I'm talking to a lot right now uses bromadiolone in Central Park because they said it's low toxicity rates for wildlife. And I was like, what are you talking about? That's not true. They're probably getting that information from a pest control operator, but because the actual data does not say that. This is also a great horned owl that was found the same time in Waltham, right across the nest from where the eagle was. So just to show again that it's not just eagles, it's also owls. But this has been going on for a while because this is Ruby the red-tailed hawk, and I don't know if people remember this. This was all the way back in 2014, the year before I became involved in activism on this issue in Fresh Pond in Cambridge. And this was the first really high-profile death that got like a spread in Boston Globe, but it just seemed like there was a very brief uptick in interest, and then it kind of faded with the season. But Tufts Wildlife Clinic, which did the necropsy on Ruby the red-tailed hawk and MK the eagle and C25, they're basically one of the foremost authorities in the nation on birds of prey and Escar's poisoning, and Dr. Maureen Murray, who is the lead veterinary researcher there, she did a study about it. At this point, I think it's almost a decade ago, that found that 86% of the birds of prey that she was studying tested positive for Escar's exposure. Not necessarily lethal limits, but that they had Escar's exposure. And then only about 5 or 6 years later, she started sampling again, and that leaped up from 86% to 96%. So in just the handful of years, 6-7 years or so, like the exposure rate went up 10%, which is really remarkable and not in a positive way. And she found that 100% of red-tailed hawks had eschars exposure, which makes sense because red-tailed hawks actually are primarily like rodent killers. Like the rats, mice, squirrels are the #1 prey items they have. So I'm going to try to go faster by seeing if I could just kind of turn away and do this. So I'm going to give a really quick background. So eschars were actually available over the counter on store shelves until about, well, first till 2008, and then the EPA actually tried to get them removed from store shelves because they were poisoning thousands of children a year. These children were disproportionately low-income children of color, usually black and brown children in like dense urban neighborhoods like the one I grew up in, because landlords were kind of just doing do-it-yourself rodent, rodent control, or like poor tenants who weren't getting help with their properties were buying these over the counter, and their kids were eating them because they look like candy, again, because they're these bright green and blue pellets. And so I just want to say the same lobbying arm that like represents the pest control companies now are the ones that fought against these being taken off store shelves because they were saying that the rate of poisoning of children was an acceptable risk. So, but finally, after like several years of tying the EPA up in court, they reached a compromise to take the eschars poisons off store shelves, but pest control operators could still use them in so-called tamper-resistant bait stations. So in other words, a consumer can't buy them on the shelves anymore, but if you get a pest control person, they'll put them in those bait stations. But here's the problem, is what it seems has happened, and what I theorize is happening, is that the pest control sector has seized on basically what is now a monopoly on this use, and they aggressively market it to people as a quick, great fix to mice and rats that only they have access to. First, that's a little bit of a lie. It is possible to buy these on the internet, which is a loophole. So you can buy a giant bucket of Rodenticides on Amazon, even though you can't buy them at store shelves. And that's obviously something the EPA should address. However, that also, a lot of pest control professionals kind of use this. Well, all the wildlife deaths you're hearing about, that's not us, that's the consumer, because they're not applying it correctly. Now, I'm not trying to dismiss that this isn't a huge problem as well, but I really do think that the majority of poisonings are from the bait stations, because you see how ubiquitous they are, right? And also because it does not matter that they're in bait stations, because bait stations do nothing to address the secondary poisoning. So the reason they took them off of the shelves is because they were saying it was primarily to help the child poisoning rates. And it has led to a decline in the child poisoning rates. Now, I would argue that I don't think any rate of child poisoning is acceptable. So it's like a 46 to 79% decline in poisoning of children by eschars. And obviously, I'm glad that there's a huge decline, but I still don't think it is enough. I really think there should be more regulations. But what's notable is the FGARs, which are still available on the store shelves. Poisonings of children by that has gone up 60 to 80% in that same exact time frame, which indicates that what's happening is now that children, just as many children are being poisoned, but it's just by the poisons that are still available on the store shelves and not the eschars. And so, like I said, there's still a problem with it online. But here's the other issue. One, these tamper-resistant bait stations, and they're not tamper-proof, which some pest control operators will tell people. They're tamper-resistant, which is a huge difference. I personally, here's one right here in Arlington that I came across. I've seen them many times broken open. This actually was right next to the Petco, and they were doing a puppy training class right outside. One puppy tried to go over and lick that bait station. So they can still expose animals firsthand if there's any problems with these bait stations when they get broken into, which they inevitably do. But And here's another case in Arlington, in the Heights area, where the squirrels broke open the bait station. You can see the squirrel in the left-hand corner, and they dispersed the bait among themselves. And then a few days later, they started dropping dead out of the trees. And the person did have them picked up because they, too, are prey items, right, for birds of prey. So that's one problem, is that these bait stations are not as tamper-resistant as a lot of time the industry will tell you. And even when I did a rally at the State House and they did a segment on rodenticides, they interviewed someone whose 2 dogs died after there were 2 bait stations containing escars that someone had vandalized, and the dogs ate the poison, and they died within two or 3 hours. They could not be saved. So that's first-hand exposure is still a problem for animals. However, the new rules with the tamper-resistant bait stations do nothing to address the problem of secondary exposure. The rodent goes into the bait box, they exit, and then they themselves now are the poison. It is in their bodies. And this is a red-tailed hawk I watched last spring stalking a rodent. It went into a bait station, and I watched it jump down. That's it. See, it's looking behind the grass. There's a bait station there, and it was stalking a rodent. And luckily, someone came out of that door. I was like, should I chase it away? Because I don't want to interfere with wildlife, but I was like, I don't want it eating a rodent that just came out of a bait station. This happens. I see this all the time, like birds of prey hanging out in dumpster areas, stalking rodents that are going around the bait station. So this is a major problem too. And the EPA knows this. For my article that I wrote in 2021, I spent weeks reading through all the EPA ecological assessments from the late 90s for the past 20 years. And they know that these have huge risks. This is a quote from their last ecological risk assessment of anticoagulant rodenticides. They say the nature of risk to birds and mammals is well established and includes mortality from both primary and secondary exposure, as well as chronic growth and reproduction effects. And yet, every time they say this, they then still allow it to be illegal. And here's actually, they've only recorded 1,200 deaths of wildlife since 1977. However, they've done that with only 3 or 4 states reporting any at all. So 46 states are not reporting their casualties at all. Massachusetts, California, and 1 or 2 other states are the only states reporting, and they're only reporting from certain places. Like the numbers from Massachusetts are only from Tufts Wildlife Clinic, because the clinic is the only one with the resources to do formal necropsies. And so some of these rates, like for instance, there's barred owl is on here, and I think it says only 4 barred owls have died from escars poisoning since 1977. And New England Wildlife Center here in Massachusetts said they've had like dozens of barred owls come in for escars poisoning and have lost like 10 or 12 in the past year or so. So obviously the EPA, even with the low numbers they have, they know these poisons are bad. But what if they actually did proper resource gathering? These would have to be illegal, but they're not. So New England Wildlife Center, which is the center that was treating MK when she died, they say that they see between 100 and 200 cases of escars poisoning a year. So that's just one rehabilitation center in one part of one state is seeing hundreds of cases a year. So again, EPA is very much understating the problem. And they're also noting that the patients are taking much longer to recover just in the past few years. So this great horned owlet in this picture, this is a very heartbreaking story. And every time they talk to me, they bring up this story. This was an entire great horned owl's nest that was completely wiped out by escars poisoning, like similar to what happened in my park. So this is happening a lot where entire nests are getting eradicated. This little owlet was bleeding from every orifice. Like you can see it running down him. They couldn't stop the blood. They even tried to give him a blood transfusion from another owl at their center, and he still died. Only 1 owl survived. I think it was a family of the 2 parents and 4 owls, so only 1 owlet survived. It took him almost an entire year of vitamin K infusions a day for his blood to clot on its own. I think it was 265 days, so about 9 months, until his blood would clot on his own. They said that that was unprecedented, that they've never seen that before, but now that is becoming more the norm. These multi-month treatments needed to get these animals for their blood to clot on their own, which is, again, just testament to how pervasive these poisons are in their systems and in our environment. So the problem is the pest control professionals can legally lie about the impacts of SCARs. And I'm not making that up. I did this as a reporter. I wrote the EPA. It took them weeks and weeks to get back to me before they finally said, yes, they're under no legal obligation to tell you the risks, even if you ask about it, which aligns with my experience back when I was fighting with my landlords and they were saying things like, I remember them saying my cat could not get SCARs poisoning because my cat food has taurine in it and that would counterbalance any poisoning. That's a real thing the pest control person told my landlord and me. So they can tell people that, and unfortunately that makes my job harder because when I go to businesses or landlords, they're like, but we talk to the pest control companies and they're the experts and they know that and they wouldn't lie because they can't legal, and I'm like, yes, they can. And the landlords and businesses also do not have to disclose what chemicals they're using to their tenants, to the people working there. And there's also issues with labeling. Like in theory, the bait stations are supposed to be labeled to say what is in those bait boxes. But there's a lot of little loopholes that can be exploited. Like technically, if the poison wasn't bought with the bait station, they don't have to put it on. Or they can put it inside the bait station, which helps no one because you can't see what's inside the bait station. So that really has caused a lot of problems. And the National Pest Management Association has fought for all of this. They've fought the labeling laws. They've fought so that they don't have to be transparent. And this was on their main goal list on their website, which they took down 2 days after I called them out on it on the Save Arlington Wildlife page. But I can still go to the Wayback Machine and take screenshots. But they wrote that they counteract activist efforts on both the national and local levels by being prepared to instantly respond on behalf of the industry. So this is very reminiscent to me of what I dealt with when I was, in my 20s working on Capitol Hill with the fossil fuel industry. It just reminds me a lot of that. And one case in point is around the same time that MK the eagle died in Arlington, Massachusetts. This poor bald eagle died in Connecticut of SCARs poisoning. And at the time, Connecticut was actually considering a ban on SCARs in the state legislature. And the National Pest Management Association and their state chapters there did fully mounted like a whole campaign about how it was going to be Ratmageddon if you banned SCARs. And the politicians, which seemed poised to pass this, like kind of backtracked, and now they're doing some kind of study committee, but they're not banning it. But the problem is that like a lot of the assertions of the pest control industry is not at all based on scientific research or evidence. I mean, one thing they like to say is they do like to fearmonger a lot about rats. You're gonna have Ratmageddon, you're gonna have Ratmageddon. And one thing I've noticed, and this is anecdotal, I would like to see some research about this, but before we had these bait stations all over Arlington, I never saw a rat. Now that we have bait stations all over Arlington, not only do I see rats all the time, I see them dying in the middle of the street. I see them in high traffic areas that you would not usually see rats. This was a rat I came across. This is actually a clip on my YouTube page. It was 4 p.m. in August on Massachusetts Avenue in a high traffic area, and this rat was dying just like inches from a bait box. It was twitching, it was spasming. Little children were walking by, people were walking their dogs. And this is something I've come across multiple times. And so I did finally get the ACO to come and put the poor rat out of his misery humanely because I didn't want him to suffer, and I also didn't want him to get eaten by something and for him to, an animal to get poisoned. But it just takes away from the public health argument. I don't know how it helps our public health if there are dead rats all the time, because here's another picture. This was just taken a few weeks ago. So that other one was from 2021, but this is a few weeks ago at Spy Pond in Arlington, just in the middle of the grassy field. 2 kids were playing touch football like feet from here, and someone was walking their dog. So we had to clean this up because I didn't want them to have contact with that rodent. Because here's the thing, studies that are coming out are showing, here's a study from 2021, that rats that have SCARs in their system are significantly more likely to carry and transmit diseases to humans like leptospirosis. And this makes sense because eschars, compromises the immune system. So again, the public health argument that eschars are necessary for rodent control, it doesn't look at the fact that these animals are more likely now because of these poisons to have diseases and give them to humans, both because it makes their immune system compromised and they have these diseases, but then they're also dying in broad daylight in high traffic areas where a human or a pet is more likely to come into contact, because a healthy rat is not going to be hanging out in the middle of the day where humans are. And so I wanted to just go into this part because I think it's the root cause of why we're finding ourselves in this dilemma is people hate and fear rats. And there's a lot of valid reasons for that, and I'm not trying to dismiss the very valid public health concerns about rodents, though I do think the pest control companies often greatly overstate the risks. Obviously, there are concerns about disease transmission, but again, like I said, animals that have eschars in them, including rodents, are more likely to have and transmit diseases. There are concerns about property damage, but there's also a lot of things about rats and rodents in general that is entrenched in, myths and folk tales and lore, and depicting them as evil, as filthy, as cruel. And I have to say, I've seen a lot of comments on places like Nextdoor and Facebook, correlating the rat problem with immigration or poor people. And so I do think it's important to interrogate why we have these biases, because that's why then we wind up doing things like spreading poisons. For instance, every time I've discussed this issue with a pest control person, they bring up the plague. And experts have now debunked that rats were the main reason that the plague spread. They actually think it was gerbils, funny enough, and I think it got lost. Oh, and humans themselves, human-specific fleas that don't infest rats, were actually the main culprits of the Black Plague. Again, I'm not trying to say that rats do not spread diseases, but just to show that every time I've had a discussion or seen them testify, they bring up the Black Plague, and we don't want to have another Black Plague like in the Middle Ages, but that wasn't actually rats. And I also want to talk about why we're noticing more rats. One reason is climate change. The warmer weather means that they're breeding more throughout the year. Usually in New England, they wouldn't be breeding throughout the winters, but we're having warmer winters, so now they're having litters all year long, and they're having larger litters. Also increased population density. More people means more trash, means more rodents. That's just the reality. For many, many years, they followed us around and they eat our trash. More development and construction. Construction and development may not necessarily boost their populations, though I think the science is mixed on that, but it definitely does disrupt their burrows, and it makes them more likely to come in conflict with us. When they get disrupted from those nesting areas, they're going to come out in the open in ways we might not have seen them before. With the pandemic, as you may have heard, when a lot of the restaurants shut down, it did make some of the rats migrate into more residential areas, but also because people were home more, they might have noticed rodents more where they might not have when they weren't home before the pandemic because they were at work or school. But also, I think poison itself is one of the reasons we have more rats. And there are some indications that this is true. The sightings of rodents and reports of rodents has gone up with the use of eschars. And so one thing I always say is, at the very least, it's showing that these eschars are not effective in reducing rodents. Because when you see the bar graph and you see eschars use up, and then you see poison, the rodent sightings going up, it's like, okay, it's not working. It's not reducing the rodents. But I do think because of several different reasons, which I'll talk about briefly, that the poisons themselves are causing an exacerbation of the rodent population. One, I just want to say there is not a single study that these poisons reduce rodents. When I was doing my article in 2021, I searched for weeks. I asked all these professionals, please send me a peer-reviewed article. No one could do it. And I was like, so why are we allowing these poisons when we don't have any data to support that they work on rodents? There's none. Only in laboratory studies, which are not at all applicable to real-life situations, or a couple in very small tropical islands, which again are not at all translatable to where we live. So the reason why rat poison doesn't work is you're luring rodents to the area. The poison itself is a food source. So if you're leaving out bait, like that's what bait means. You're baiting the rodents into an area. And something that's interesting to note is that both the USDA and the EPA do not recommend these poisons be used to prevent rodents because they know that that's a problem. They only recommend using these poisons if other options have failed, but they say to not use it to prevent the rodents because you are luring them into the area, but also even if you're using them when other options have failed, they said to not leave them out long term because then it becomes part of the problem. But as you know, we see these bait stations, they're just perpetually there. So they're part of the problem they purport to be solving. The other thing is rats and mice can build biological resistance to anticoagulant rodenticides. The whole reason that second generation anticoagulant rodenticides exist is because the first generation ones, the rats built biological resistance and immunity to it, the way, if you've heard of antibiotic resistance. And that's because rats and mice breed so much and so fast that they can build this immunity in a way that, higher order, like things with a lot lower birth rates can. Same things with insects, right? That's why a lot of times pesticides get updated all the time because they build immunity to this. And so like with the first generation, studies are showing that the mice and rats are building resistance to the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. And the problem is, though, their predators are not. So a good percentage of these rodents are probably not dying from eating these poisons, but their predators still are because their predators do not have the immunity or the resistance that the rodents do. Rats and mice are also very smart, and they can learn to associate these bait stations with something that's harming them or their family. I know that sounds funny, but it's true. It's called bait shyness. They can be like, okay, that something's wrong with that, and they're very picky. So if you're putting down a bait station, they go there, they're like, I don't like the way this tastes, it's funny. Oh, but look, there's this delicious trash right next to it. I'm gonna eat that. So you've lured them to the property, but if you're not cleaning up your dumpsters, you're basically giving them other options after you've drawn them in with the bait. And like I said, you're killing off their natural predators, and that in turn is gonna boost their populations. So I think I mentioned that my background was I was studying wolf biology, and they talk a lot about what happened in Yellowstone, where after they got rid of the wolves, the deers exploded. They overgrazed the territory, and it led to basically a lot of these dead zones in Yellowstone. And I think that's what we're doing now, this kind of trophic cascade where we're killing off these predators, and we're going to let the rodents, the prey populations, explode, because their predators are not there to control them. And I think it's just important to realize that rats and mice do play a role in our ecosystem, one of those being that they are a huge staple of a lot of the food chain, not just the birds of prey, but coyotes and foxes and raccoons and skunks. There's just snakes and weasels, opossums, they all eat rats and mice. And so we need to have some of them at least in our environment. And they also scavenge and help clean up trash and aid in seed dispersal. The best way, I think, to prevent rodents is really waste management. And I know that that's very hard for people because, human behavior is hard to change. But something I am going to say is I really hope people will rethink having bird feeders, especially during the warmer weather months. There have been actual studies that show rodent populations increasing in areas where bird feeders are very common, and that they show that they did some kind of survey where they showed that homes with bird feeders, that they almost always had a nearby nest of a rodent that was using that as a food source. And if you do have to have a bird feeder, like I said, avoid it during the warmer weather months, like April through October or November, and do not keep it out overnight. Keep your composting indoors if possible, pick up pet waste. If possible at all, do not take your trash out till the night before the morning of pickup. And you work on emphasizing exclusion, so seeing what entry points rodents could be getting into a home, and barricading that, I think, is one of the most important things to at least keeping them out of your home. Okay, so we're in the home stretch. So here are some other things besides those things, because right, those things that I just went through are what you could do just in your home to try to prevent rodents. But if you're like, I really care about this issue, I want to know what I can do to get my community to make a change, because I'm seeing these bait stations everywhere. So I started Save Arlington Wildlife. I actually started it when the owls died, before MK died, but it didn't get galvanized into more like public attention until after MK died. But some of the things that Save Arlington Wildlife has done is we started a poison-free pledge campaign that both homeowners and businesses can sign up, and we give the businesses signs, so it's kind of like giving them a little gold star. I mean, there are some challenges to that because some of the business owners, they're not in charge of if they use poison, it's the property owners, but if they can or they're not using poison, it just kind of helps to raise awareness and incentivizes property owners and business owners to think about what they're using. But here's the big one. So Arlington is the first municipality in 2021, actually before MK died, we passed a public ban on eschars, meaning our town cannot use eschars on any of its municipal lands or properties. So here in the state of Massachusetts, and most states in the country, unfortunately, and the pest control lobby has fought very hard for this, municipalities, towns, and cities cannot ban pesticides, including rodenticides, on private property. It's called preemption, and their states have preemption laws. However, municipalities can ban whatever they want on their own lands, right, on their public parks or municipal buildings that they own. So we banned it on our public lands, and we also submitted a home rule petition to the state asking for permission to ban it on private property. So whenever there's a state law that doesn't allow a town or city to do something, they can submit what's called a home rule petition, and they can say, we want to do this. We want an exception to the rule. And in this case, we said, we've banned them on our public lands, but our wildlife are still dying, like MK. We would like permission to ban it on private property, because until that happens, we're going to still get a lot of wildlife dying in our town. So that's something we did. We did that in 2021. You can also request the Board of Health not allow eschars during construction. So something I found out when I was doing research for my article, I did a public records request, and there's a lot of construction and development going on everywhere, right? Probably here as well. Every time they demolish an area and do construction, usually towns or cities will require that the developer do a rodent management plan, and there's different things they require from towns or cities, but my town at the time was requiring that there had to be bait stations. They didn't require it had to be poison, and some towns and cities do, though. But the bait stations alone were incentivizing poison, and I found out that 30 out of 32 construction projects in 2021 had eschars in them, even though almost all of them had no rodent sightings, because they have to do an assessment first to see if there's rodent sightings or activity. So they were being used, these poisons, as a preventative, even though there was no rodents there. So again, it's not supposed to be used as a preventative, but it was. So I basically named and shamed them in my article, and they didn't like that, and they got a lot of attention. So they changed their rules so that now during the construction projects, they're not using poison. And you can also look at your housing authority, because a lot of times housing authorities use poison, and we also pressured the Arlington Housing Authority to stop using poison, and it did, especially since one of their properties abuts the cemetery where MK was found. First when C25 was found dead, found dying, they decided to change their rules because we wrote an open letter and had all these people sign on. So this is what I just spoke about Arlington passing the home rule petition. In 2023, just this year, the city of Newton followed suit. They also passed a public ban of eschars in all of their parks and city buildings, and they also submitted a home rule petition. Where's the person? There's our poison-free pledge thing. Here's a bunch of lawn signs. You can see, I think, the other ones in front of my podium that we also have all around town. This is just a good way to sort of get the word out, spread awareness. These are just some other ideas that some other cities are doing other than home rule petitions and bans. City of Somerville has done a lot of great stuff, even though they are using poison on their public land, so that's something I want to work with them to stop doing. But they have rat-resistant trash toters that they give to every citizen. They require dumpster licensing, which means the people have to get their dumpsters inspected once or twice a year to make sure it's cleaned out. They did do a contrapest pilot, which is basically birth control for rodents, which did reduce the rats by 57 to 67%. They're not doing that anymore. That was back in 2017. Right now, they're doing a pilot of high-volume electric traps, and they're doing an education and awareness campaign. So these are some good things to do to counterbalance, mandates, but I still want to stress that I think it's important to ban these poisons and then do things like that to help mitigate them, because Somerville right now, like I said, they are using poisons. And I told them, well, don't you think you're undermining your own efforts when you're using these poisons? Because they even acknowledged to me when I had an interview with them a couple weeks ago that they know there's no data to show it affects the rodents, and they're not seeing a discernible reduction with the use of escars. But they said people like to see them to feel like we're doing something. And I was like, well, that's not really a great reason. But I hope that maybe they'll go back to, they weren't using poisons for a while, and I'm hoping they'll go back to it. Here's some other ideas, is just better signage at places about wildlife feeding. I know wildlife feeding is a huge problem where I am at the ponds. Like, people will throw entire loaves of bread in with the ducks, and that's also where we have huge rodent problems. Like the rodent was at Spy Pond that I showed you that I came across a few weeks ago. Some parks I know in Belmont have done carry-in, carry-out policies, so no trash cans at their parks, so you have to take your trash with you. Sometimes you can do increased trash pickup. Actually, my affordable housing complex, when I was still living there, I don't think they're still doing it, but they were doing twice a week pickup for a while, and that did help reduce the rodents. And more rat-resistant trash receptacles around town centers and busy places where there's a lot of rat sightings like those, because those are a lot harder for rodents to get into than those open trash cans. So, like I said, preemption is a big problem. This is the state law, if people are interested, that would get rid of preemption and return the power to municipalities to be able to ban these poisons or any pesticide that's harmful. So Save Arlington Wildlife has endorsed that bill and worked with other organizations to endorse it. As I mentioned, there's the home rule petition, and even though the home rule petition is submitted by Arlington, I just want to say that it has to be voted by the whole state legislature. So you can still talk to your state rep or senator and say you support this bill, because if it passes, it does establish an important legal precedent that will make it a lot easier for any other municipalities to do this. And also, the more municipalities that submit home rule petitions, the more likely it is that the state will revise its policies, likely on its own without legislation. That has happened with other issues, certain climate change issues, where several municipalities will submit home rule petitions and the state starts to look bad, right? Like, what are you doing? And so they've just on their own would change some policies. So we are working with other municipalities to try to get them to persuade their local government to vote a home rule petition to ban the escars on private property, which is where most of it is being used. So this was a postcard campaign we did for the local control bill. Here we did this rally in May when both Arlington's home rule petition and the local control bill and another bill were getting its hearing. And it got a lot of news. It got this piece in the Herald, and it got on CBS News, but also someone from the Boston Globe editorial board was there, and he got very interested in this issue. And on 4th of July weekend, or a couple of days before 4th of July, we got a top page editorial in the Boston Globe about this issue, including supporting the home rule petition. And it's very hard to get the Boston Globe editorial to weigh in on a home rule petition, but they did in support of it. So again, just this is a quote from the National Pest Management Association fighting against any kind of return of local control of rodenticides to municipalities. They were actually at that hearing that day. They were very emphatic, both against Arlington's home rule petition and the local control bill. This is another bill that you may have heard of, the Hawkins bill. This bill would create a digital database that would track where and when these poisons are used, which is still very important because, like I said, we don't even know where they're being used. A lot of times they're not labeled. The one thing, though, that we would like to see this bill strengthen, though, because the initial version of the bill required that the pest control professionals had to disclose the impacts, the risks of these poisons, and that they had to get a signed consent form from customers, which I think, like I said, that's been a huge struggle for us, right? Is if the pest control people are allowed to lie, it makes it a lot harder for people to make informed decisions. And then they wind up putting their children or their pets or the local wildlife at risk. So I really hope that that language can be added back in before it gets voted in on. And so, like I said, Save Arlington Wildlife, besides the local things we do to raise awareness in Arlington, we seed groups in other towns and cities with the ultimate goal hoping they'll do what we did, which is pass a public ban on eschars, as well as submit a home rule petition to ban it on private property. And then we also work in collaboration with the other groups where we have chapters on the state legislation. And right now we have about a half a dozen chapters in Lexington, Belmont, Waltham, Winchester, Natick. And we're always looking for more. I'm always glad to talk to anybody who's interested in starting an effort where they live. And that is it. I'm sorry this was a little awkward with me having to look over my shoulder. But just a couple of final words is I'm working on a complete shoestring budget. I'll mostly volunteer, but this has basically become my full-time job. So if you are like, I want to support Laura and her work for Save Arlington Wildlife, that we do have a Patreon. I don't know if people are familiar with Patreon. You can give usually it's a monthly thing. You can give 5 or 10 or 15 or however much money a month. And that's my PayPal. I do have plans to either turn Save Arlington Wildlife into a nonprofit by or around the new year, or get a fiscal sponsor, but I haven't gotten to do that yet. And the other thing is we do have these, I felt like I was gonna be like Superman. We have these t-shirts, and I'm all sweaty now up here, but I wanted to do this like Spider-Man, like our Superman thing, but we do have these shirts too that are for sale at our bonfire site, which talk about rat poison being wildlife poison. And this is MK, actually. This is a graphic of one of the photos I made of her. So those are just some ways to support Save Arlington Wildlife. And I wanted to end with this quote from Rachel Carson. I began with a quote from her. "How could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind? Yet this is precisely what we have done. We have done it, moreover, for reasons that collapse in the moment we examine them." So I felt like this quote seems very applicable to a lot of the things we spoke about tonight, and I'm hoping that you too, in examining eschars tonight with me, feel like the reasons for using them have sort of collapsed. And I'm glad to answer any questions.
I would, yeah. So, let me ask you, first of all, that was great.
Thanks.
Thanks a million. So I live in a 268 unit complex in Salem.
Okay.
And we've talked about this.
This is just for the video.
We've talked about this. I don't want to blast anybody out of the room.
You're good.
And we've talked about this, and they all agree with it. But you're responding to a homeowner who has either a rat or mice. Mm-hmm. What management company can you call? Mm-hmm. What specific thing can you use to rid that building, that unit, mm-hmm. of the mice or rats? And that seems to be what's happening. Mm-hmm. People are convinced of this because they see it, but what's the alternative?
Yeah, so SaveArlingtonWildlife.org, we do have a page, Alternatives to Rodenticide, where we go into a bunch of different alternatives that you can use. There are other rodenticides that are not as bad as anticoagulant rodenticides, though I would still exercise some caution with those. Like the anticoagulant rodenticides are the worst. And bromethalin also is very bad. I just wanted to, like the neurotoxin I spoke about. But there's vitamin D, which I'm not I'm not crazy about because it can be very deadly to dogs if the bait stations are broken open, like I pointed out, but they don't have secondary impacts. So some people have turned to that. There's something called Radex, which fatally dehydrates the rodents. There's something else that's similar to Radex, but instead of gluten, I think it uses potato starch. And I have this listed on the site. Like I said, there's contrapest and there's trapping. People do have a lot of less patience for trapping, but it is more sustainable over the longer term. So what I've been telling people to look at is there are pest control professionals, but there's also something called problem animal control agents. Full disclosure is I'm studying to become a problem animal control agent, one, just because I would like to be able to be as educated about this as possible, and I want to be able to help people find other alternatives. And a problem animal control agent, they will look at your whole property and they'll find out what is drawing the rodents. They will do full-scale exclusion, so whatever the barriers, whatever the points of entry are for the rodents, and they will do very targeted trapping, so not just laying out traps haphazardly. They'll find where the rodents are coming and going and put those traps down. So sometimes you can get a pack agent who is also a pest control professional, so you want to be careful. If you do want to stay away from poison, you still might want to stress, we don't want poisons, we want the exclusion and the trapping services and non-poison control options. One company that I've been recommending to people is there's one that is a pack agent, they're called the Bat Guys.
What guy?
The bat, guys. And as their name suggests, they do a lot of control of bats who get in attics and stuff, but they do rodent control as well. They have a page for every animal they control, so they have one for mice and rats. And they are a poison-free company, and they have really good reviews. So I would recommend talking to a problem animal control company or agent like the Bat Guys and seeing if they can help control rodents. Because again, the problem is if people really do want to not have rodents, I say this as someone who, like I said, we never had rodents at my affordable housing complex when I lived there until we had the bait stations. And then we started getting rats and mice. I even got them in my apartment, and I have several cats, and I had not had a mouse in a place I lived in over 20 years, and we didn't get mice and rats coming onto our property until we got all these poisons. And part of that is the stuff I discussed, that the poison itself is an attractant. But I also notice there's a psychological thing that happens when people are putting down poison. It makes them more complacent about the other things that matter. So when they started putting down poison in my property, the landlord stopped cleaning the dumpsters. Suddenly, the dumpsters were so bad, and the trash people weren't even picking them up sometimes because they weren't in compliance because they were overflowing. And so there were other things that were getting ignored that were drawing the rodents. And the poison's not going to stop them. Like I said, the rodents were I had pictures of rodents just skipping right over the poison bait stations to break open the trash. And it wasn't just rodents. We were also, it was scary to even go into my trash shed at night because we were getting raccoons in there because it was so bad. So there's also that problem as well, as people will put the poison down, but when they're not addressing the other things, sometimes they become complacent and those other problems are worse, and that further draws the rodents into the area. Do you have a follow-up question for that?
I'm all set.
Okay, great.
Hey, Laura?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Thanks. So I heard you talk about how the pest control agents warned about Ratmageddon
Yes.
if bans were put in place.
Yes.
Can you talk about places where bans have been put in place?
Okay. He's helping me plug parts of this because he's been to so many of these. He knows all about the issue too. Yeah, I didn't mention it because this is such a Massachusetts-specific PowerPoint, but California banned these eschars through most of the state, with some exemptions, but it's the only state in the nation right now that has a ban in effect, and British Columbia as well. And the studies have shown there's no indication that rats have, there's no rat-pocalypse happening. Again, strangely, I've been places where the pest control industries have showed up and said there is, and I was like, no, there's not. The data is out. So And not only that, British Columbia, the city of Richmond in the province of British Columbia, they did a year-long moratorium on escars, and it was so successful, and there was no net cost to the economy that after a year and a half, they were like, we're permanently adopting this, because they weren't getting Ratmageddon. They were saving money. It was not costing them anything. So the places that have done these bans and that have like phased them out have not seen any like huge uptick in rats or anything like that. Yeah.
So my name's Heather Packard. I work for Mass Audubon, and we've been so impressed by the work of Laura and Save Arlington Wildlife. As a whole organization wide, we are joining this effort and helping organize and helping Laura to help, because she's one person, to support towns across the state to get these, these bylaw amendments that need to get done. So, and part of that, because it is a big organization with lots of resources, we have full-time dedicated like policy analysts and people, that's like their job. And so we actually also just very recently, as we've been just recently started partnering with her, well, we're going to have our own web page, page as part of Mass Audubon's web page. We wanted to make sure we did our research too, and we had hers, but we're like, we have to do ours because our scientists would always want to do that. They talked to the people in British Columbia. They've been like in long, in-depth phone calls with them within the last month. And there is no indication at all that escars they can't find any proof that using escars actually reduces rat population, and that not using them has caused any massive explosion of rats. Like they literally were looking for that, because that's always your big concern, as we as an organization were going to join this, we wanted to make sure we were prepared to answer that question, when we talk to a city official or a Board of Health person or something. We wanted to be sure that we knew the facts. And everything she just said is completely exactly what we found as well. I just wanted to put that weight of these additional scientists of Mass Audubon and policy analysts behind it. It's very true.
I actually have a question. We know, obviously, that the poison rats are killing our birds of prey. What about the other types of wildlife that eat the rats? Are they affected as well?
Yes. So this was a very bird of prey heavy presentation, but yes, there are wide impacts on a lot of our fur-bearing mammal species, coyotes, foxes. We did have a fox that also died in Arlington that we crowdfunded and had him necropsied, and it was escars poisoning. Also, there are a lot of indirect contributions to the mortalities that aren't even getting counted. So there have been studies, a lot of lengthy data collection studies that show that escars poisoning or escars exposure makes coyotes and fox get sarcoptic mange, and that is the thing that is actually killing them. So similar to, like I said, with the rats who have escars get diseases, it's making them more susceptible to secondary diseases, and those diseases are killing them. So there's a huge problem right now with foxes and coyotes dying of mange that have escars poisoning in their system, as well as sometimes just directly dying of the escars poisoning. There was a whole population of bobcats out in California that was almost wiped out by, I'm not sure if I'm going to say it right, a different kind of mange mite, like a notodetic mange, I think it's called. I just interviewed that bobcat biologist a couple of weeks ago, and the studies were very clear. And that was actually a first-generation anticoagulant rodenticide, difascinone, and California just banned that as well because of these bobcats were getting wiped out by the mange caused by that. Squirrels are very susceptible. Also, like I said, a lot of the mid-level animals that people don't realize do also eat our rodents, like raccoons, possums, skunks. A lot of them are listed who that wind up dead or dying of these too. And those are basically animals that are really critical to our urban ecology and keeping these rodents in check. So yeah, a lot of mammals. There are some studies that also show some reptiles, namely snakes, which also can eat rats and mice, are also some of them are impacted as well, but especially mammals and birds of prey. And even some birds you don't really think of that also eat, like herons. Herons usually eat fish, but they can and will eat rodents. I've seen them eat rodents, and like there have been some that have died of rodenticide poisoning. Kingfishers. So crows, a lot of crows have died because they will scavenge dead and dying rodents. So it is not just birds of prey. Birds of prey just bear the brunt, especially in certain areas, because they do eat so many rodents. And I just also want to mention that there was a study out of California that specifically looked at an area that did not have anticoagulant rodenticide poisoning and an area that did, and the area that didn't had a healthy population of great horned owls and red-tailed hawks, and they found that the area with the red-tailed hawks and the great horned owls, 50% more control of the rodents there than the area with the poison. So there's been some peer-reviewed studies too that show that our predators are our best natural defense against rodents, and the irony is like we are actually adversely impacting their ability to control the rodents, which in some ways makes sense because the pest control companies they're kind of taking out their best competitors for rodent control by doing this. But so yeah, a lot of mammals. I've heard in some places out west, wolves are starting to show poisoning impacts, and in California, several mountain lions died of Escar's poisoning. And Raptors Are the Solution, which is the group that worked on the Escar's ban there, she said that was the thing that really started to impress people, that this huge, very large carnivore that you don't think of that's going to be impacted because you think, oh, they don't eat rats, they only eat deer or something, but they were being felled by these poisons. She said that seemed to really impress people with the gravity of the problem when the mountain lions were dying from Escar's poisoning or mange or other diseases caused by the Escar's poisoning. And like I said, bobcats too.
There was a study that they were in river otters.
Yeah, otters.
So, yeah, there's studies now out that they've tested just all kinds of wildlife that have nothing to do with the food chain
Yeah.
of a rat, like river otters, and they have Escars in their system. So it's becoming very pervasive, I think, in wildlife in general.
There was a study on fishers, and Dr. Marie Murray gave a PowerPoint last week online, and I referred to it in the beginning of this, but she was saying there are studies that are showing, like I said, that like songbirds are getting into these bait stations, like sparrows, and so it's getting into the food chain that way. And insects eat this bait sometimes. Obviously, how insects, ants, and stuff love to eat anything kind of crumbly. There were studies showing that the insects are getting in and eating this bait, and so things that are eating the insects, are like including songbirds, including other things that we don't think of, they're getting the poisons in their system too. It's just becoming almost like a pervasive part of our food chain, which is very upsetting to think about.
I can also tell you, unfortunately from experience, that when these poisons are put out, part of the problem with homeowners who put them out is saying, well, we don't see the dead rats. That's because they'll eat the poison and then they go someplace else to die.
Yeah.
Because, as I say from experience, I had a neighbor who did put out poison, and I found the rats on my front lawn and in my home. And I know I didn't put that out because I would never do that. So it's really, and I think that's part of it, that people say, well, no, I never saw it. I never saw the rat. Well, it's because it went someplace else.
Seeing most of the owls or the hawks or the eagles either. In what tiny percentage? I mean, if you think about what tiny percentage of a hawks, owls, or eagles, or any other raptor are actually dying in front of a person that gets taken. I mean, it's a tiny percentage.
Yeah.
We don't see wildlife deaths out in the woods.
Yeah, so many of the animals that are probably, I can't say how many times someone will send me an animal and say that that they saw it along the road and it's gone. Last week, a screech owl showed up dead in my neighborhood on Mass Ave, And we know a nest that's a block or two from there, so I think it was one of those. And we don't know if it was poison because it got collected by the town and disposed of before I could get the body and test. So the problem is I wish the state, or I wish like state would have resources to test the animals other than just the MISA listed species, because then they can, like, again, exploit the ignorance around and be like, well, we don't know because it could be West Nile or it could be avian flu, which it could be. But I do think that it's a lot more prevalent because every animal we've tested so far, which isn't a lot, but every single animal we've tested with the crowdfunding, it's been very high lethal levels of eschars in their system. So just think if we had a protocol to test everything we could find.
Talking at that point. Yeah, actually, we had a great horned owl family in Salem 2 years ago, and the mother and all 3 babies died.
Yeah.
And I have a photo of one of them because I had monitored the owls like for months. And I have a photo of one of the babies lying next to a half-eaten rat, which was pretty unbelievable.
God.
Yeah, I can't even look at it. And I called the environmental police, and they came and basically said, great horned owls are a dime a dozen. They're not, they don't need to be protected, and we're not going to do anything. Because I said, well, can't you do a necropsy or something? And they wouldn't. The most they would do was they took the mother, and they were going to see if they could stuff it and use it for, you can imagine how I felt, stuff it and use it for educational purposes, but there was nothing they could do about any of the others. And the father owl was actually still feeding the 3rd baby owl after the mother had died, and then that one died too. So it wasn't tested, but you will never convince me that's not what it was.
So that is why we do the testing when we can. I do say, that this is something you can look into, is some wildlife rehabbers that work with birds will work with you if you can crowdfund and get some money together. Because the wildlife rehabbers, the other problem is they're on shoestring budgets. They're working out of their own pocket. And it's about $130 a necropsy.
It was 165, and the second time it happened to a barred owl, which dropped out of a tree and was just laying there on the ground. That one I did have tested,
Is that
and
the
I
Beverly
paid for
one?
it. Huh?
Was that the one in Beverly, or is that a different one?
Oh no, this is a different one.
Wow, that's really macabre that there was one in Beverly that we got tested too that just dropped dead out of and it was also eschars poisoning. So I'm actually considering doing a warrant in Arlington. Like I said, we've already done all the mandates, but I'm considering doing a warrant asking the town to establish a protocol for testing and maybe a small slush fund of like $1,000 or $2,000 a year. Because I do think if we made more municipalities accountable for testing, at least those that have the resources, which at least Arlington does, it's a pretty affluent town, I think that would be helpful. But in the meantime, we're just doing this this crowdfunding for testing because we do think data is important. And it's sad that it shouldn't be up to average citizens. And when they make arguments about great horned owls, it doesn't take, there was a time when American bald eagles were very healthy populations, and then within a matter of decades, DDT obliterated them. So things can be very healthy until they're not. And there's so many other threats right now for bird species that are compounding this problem, like West Nile virus and avian flu. So they're already having a lot of these problems, and then you add eschars in. Like maybe in 10 years we're going to regret saying that if suddenly they're a rare species because this has always been our problem, right? We wait until things are a crisis level, and it's to try to fix things, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's much easier to try to prevent than cure, and I worry that we're really going to wait until it's crisis level for these other species. It already is more tenuous for bald and golden eagles and peregrine falcons. So we should also just care, he should also care about a great horned owl because most likely there are those other sensitive species in that area that are also eating those rodents. Because I showed the picture the bald eagle that died in Waltham that same week that the great horned owl died, that was a nest right across the river in that same area. So they're obviously eating the same rodents that are eating the same poison. So that's a problem. Oh, and I realized I forgot this slide when I was trying to hurry up, but I just want to mention cats and dogs are also vulnerable. The MSPCA reports that they see dozens of cases, and that again is just the one veterinary practice, the MSPCA Angel, every year of cats and dogs who have rodenticide poisoning. The cases peak during the spring and fall. The cost of veterinary care is about $2,000, and it takes weeks of supported care. So this is also a problem, and sometimes it's firsthand exposure. Like I said, those dogs that were in that segment that got into that bait, but it's also can be secondary. Sometimes dogs and definitely cats can eat a mouse. Cats are a little more resistant to whatever reason for anticoagulant rodenticides, but that does not mean that they're not like completely immune. They can get sick and die too. And I have a little picture of my cat Samson because, like I said, we never had rats or mice in my building until they started using poison, and then a mouse got in my apartment, and he caught it. But luckily, he just put it in the box with his mousy toys, and he showed them to me. And so but I was scared. So I asked my landlords, are we still using poison? And they wouldn't tell me. And it turned out they worked with the pest control people to peel the labels off of the bait stations, and they had been telling us it was snap traps. And I complained to, you can complain to the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture, and they can come in if they're not being properly labeled. But that's one of those things that can get done, is that they can peel the labels off, and then they'll tell you it's not poison, but it turns out it is. Luckily, he was fine. He didn't eat the mouse, but it's just a concern too, is that cats and dogs are very susceptible as well. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna actually ask about cats and dogs to make
Yeah.
a point, because I had heard of a woman. She lived in a duplex, and her cat died of rodenticide that she let out, and she's like, how could this possibly happen? I don't use rodenticide. Well, the next cat that she got, she said, I'm going to leave the cat inside. And that cat died of rodenticide, and she's like, now I'm really confused. Turned out her neighbor was using the rat poison.
And the rodents.
So she lost 2 cats because she didn't know her neighbor was using rodenticide. And I bet her neighbor didn't know that
Yeah, they don't
neighbor
know.
was killing cats. But I want to ask really quickly, because I think the pets thing plays into it. Can you talk in broad brushstrokes about, so when I see that bill up there, that bill for $2,000, we're talking kind of social justice here. We're talking how it affects people with lower incomes and perhaps disabled people. Can you talk in broad brushstrokes about how the rodenticide poisoning of raptors affects, it's basically a classist thing also, or affects social justice?
Well, so as I mentioned, this really started with children getting poisoning, and the children were largely low-income children of color. And when it came to my building, I was living at the time, I no longer live there, at an affordable housing complex in Arlington. And I would watch the young children who are from the exact demographics that are most vulnerable to these poisonings, sticking their hands in these bait stations, like playing with them, putting them in their games. And I would tell the landlord, I am concerned that a child could get poisoned. I was also I said, I'm concerned my cat could die. My cat is my emotional support animal. I would see people with their service dogs in my building, like sniffing around those bait stations. And I was told, well, you have to make some risks to control the rodents, which we didn't have at the time. Like I said, we got them later. But I was like, you're putting like low-income people at risk. You're putting their children at risk. You're putting their animals at risk. So I was very attuned to this social justice aspect of it. And at the time, I was also getting heavily dismissed, not just by my landlords, which I'd like to say, I think they were dismissing me even though I'm a degreed biologist, because, well, you're just a low-income tenant. How could you possibly know more than the pest control person, even though you have a graduate degree in this, and you used to study wildlife? Town officials were very rolling their eyes at me for a couple of years until the wildlife started showing up dead. But I have seen this argument get made by some pest control, and I had 2020, I did an op-ed in the Boston Globe where, it was like, should these be banned? And I was yes. They do this kind of yes-no thing. And so the person who was no was the president of the time of the New England Pest Control Management Association, Galvin Murphy, and he was the president of Yankee Pest Control. And other than bringing up the plague and how we're going to get the plague again, his argument was like, you don't want to deprive the low-income people of the rodent control because they're the ones that really need it. Those low-income communities and those low-income, tenants, they're the ones that want the rodent. And it was just so galling to me because at the time I was like fighting with my landlords. I was getting eviction threats by my landlords for this, living in affordable housing hand to mouth, trying to work on this issue. And I knew none of my neighbors wanted this poison either. And we were not being listened to by the landlords or the pest control operators. So they love to like sort of exploit this class and racial justice issues, but the truth is they actually fight against these communities because it was the low-income children that were getting poisoned that they were fighting against and saying, oh, well, they 10,000 getting poisoned a year, that's okay. And the city of Richmond, which is a lower-income city, and I think it's a disproportionately like BIPOC community in British Columbia, like the Pest Control Association, one of the management or trade associations submitted this letter about you don't want to deprive that community of their, of like escars because they need it. And they wrote a rebuttal, like a lot of these environmental justice groups, like we do not want this poison around our children. And then the pest control companies rebutted them and started fighting with them and saying that they didn't know what's best for them. So there's a lot of these justice issues that are at play too. And so I do try to let people know it's not just about the wildlife. It is also a human rights issue. It is also an environmental and social justice issue too. And I think the wildlife and who gets to experience wildlife is also a justice issue. Because again, I grew up poor. I didn't get to see things like bald eagles and great horned owls until I was an adult. And to get to see it in the Boston metro area, my first bald eagle that I saw was when I was living in Alaska working on wildlife issues. He was way in the distance. I still have the picture somewhere, but it's super foggy. Alaska is one of the only, I think it was the only state where they didn't almost go extinct. But to be able to say, oh, I had this eagle nesting in my backyard in the Boston metro area, and we humans messed up again. We dropped the ball again. And I know that there are people who are like, I never got to see, bald eagles. You didn't get to see bald eagle for decades. There are people whose whole lifetime, they're never going to get to experience that. And we're just starting to get this sort of rewilding in our communities, and we're ruining it with these poisons. And so it really my heart is in my throat when I talk about these things because it really is such a precious thing to have. And I can feel like it's slipping away if we don't take decisive action soon on this. And I think we'll regret it if we don't.
Can I ask, can you compare the mice poisons that we would find and just that you can get at a hardware store or something like that? And is there, what's the risk level of those?
So everything but escars are available over the counter. So you can get first-generation anticoagulant rodenticides. You can get bromethalin, which is the neurotoxin I spoke about, or you can get the vitamin D bait, which is known as cholecalciferol, all over the counter. And they have different risk levels in different ways, right? None of these poisons are benign. That's another thing I get worried about. I don't want people to just think, let's slot in one poison for another, because I think we're then going to we're going to open up another can of worms. So, like I said, the first generation anticoagulant rodenticides, children now are getting poisoned at very high rates from those, even because now that the escars are banned, a lot of people are buying those, and a lot of the same demographics of children are winding up poisons. And one of those poisons, difascinone, like I said, was just banned in California because it's causing fatal mange in their bobcat populations. We don't have bobcat populations quite as high, at least in this part of Massachusetts, but I think in Western Mass we have some populations. So there's risks with all of them. The bromethalin, which has been highly touted until very recently, I've noticed that they've sort of backed off, but even the MBTA was using bromethalin at some of their construction sites, like in Winchester, where I'll be presenting next week. They were like, bromethalin's friendly. It's an environmentally, I have this as a quote, an environmentally friendly alternative to the escars. And bromethalin is, like I said, it's a neurotoxin, but the new studies out of Tufts Wildlife Clinic show that it is also winding up in the the liver tissue in very high amounts in birds of prey than initially, because we just weren't studying it. So a lot of times we haven't studied it yet so that it's not causing it. Like here in the United States, we do not follow precautionary principle. We're more like, let's just run with it and see what damage it causes rather than test these things first. So bromethalin is now, it has also been indicated as culpable, as a contributor to the death of a bald eagle out of Saugus that happened around the same time as MK. So I definitely ask people to not use bromethalin either. I mean, right now our campaign is focused on eschars just because we're stretched so thin, and that's what is mostly being used. But I do tell people, and it's on our page, please don't use bromethalin. For vitamin D, I would say be careful because it doesn't seem to have the secondary impacts, but if a bait station breaks open and a dog eats that, the dog will likely die, and there is no antidote. Like with the anticoagulants, you can use vitamin K to clot the blood, but with the vitamin D, there's no antidote, so you just have to kind of flush their system, give them fluids, and hope for the best. But it's still pretty toxic, and it's killed a number of dogs in Massachusetts and New York. So all of these poisons come with risks. That's why they're called poisons. Like they all have firsthand exposure if a child or an animal eats it, and several of them still have secondary exposures, not just the eschars. So. Yeah, it's a problem. And there was just a person whose cat in our Arlington group ate a bromethalin bait, and she almost died, and she had to spend $5,000. So that $2,000 wasn't to help her. She had to crowdfund for the fee. So I would just stress to be really careful about these other poisons because they're not innocuous either.
Thank you.
So I was you were talking about how it worries you that here are all these problems and around these poisons, and that if we don't get organized and move on them, it's just going to get worse. And so it's just something that I want you to know, with Laura Help and with Mass Audubon and other organizations and coalition building, I really do think that there's a lot of potential to actually get the state to pay attention. And following the lead of Laura and Save Arlington Wildlife, where they had the bylaw amendment, it had these 3 parts to it that she could share with anyone who's interested, I'm sure. But that our director of Legislative and Government Affairs, Sam Anderson, that I work with, he worked for Senator Barrett in the State House for 10 years, and he was trying to help us decide about the different campaigns and what we were going to work on, and he really loved what Arlington had done and said, he really feels that if 10 or more towns could pass a similar bylaw, that there is a decent, there's no guarantees, but there is literally a decent chance that the state legislature would actually do something. Find a solution. They might not pass every individual home rule petition, but they might look for a bigger, broader solution statewide. And he's seen it happen with other bills. So I want to encourage anyone who's here to think about, reaching out to Laura or I and thinking about, is there a town around here that might have more potential than others? Which town would it be? And, it only takes a couple of people to get it started, and then with our support, we can help. There's hundreds of Mass Audubon members in every town. We have 160,000 members statewide. So we would help recruit them to this, all right? So not that all 600 would show up, but even if it doesn't take that many. It takes someone who's passionate and willing to put in some time on it. But, thinking it's also, I think, good to be a little strategic, I think, I have a select board member that might be an ally in this town, or thinking strategically about places that might be a little easier to actually get it passed. Every town we organize in might not end up passing that bylaw amendment either. There's that chance. But we're probably going to end up with about 20 campaigns already. I have enough people around the state that have been reaching out to me once we started talking about it. There's actually a ton of people in Mass Audubon that have already been passionate about this and are starting to email me. So anyway, so just if you guys were thinking to work together, think about where you might do this. We would, either of us or both of us together, we're working a lot together. Would love to help support you to get. Yeah, I have a business. Oh, great. Yeah. But I just want to encourage you to take action, and know that with Mass Audubon and Laura and Save Arlington Wildlife, there's so many resources. You wouldn't be doing this alone, and you wouldn't have to recreate the wheel, right? Arlington did it. They made the wheel, so we're modeling it after them.
And I mean, the thing is, it's like that saying, like think globally, act locally. I just find that municipal politics, it's so much easier to navigate than the state or the federal level, because these people know you, they live in your area. It's a lot easier usually to break through on the local level for laws than the state or the federal level. Did you have a question?
Yeah. I also live in Salem with this one here next to me. And I periodically, if I see something that's going on, I get on my email because I am getting information that I pass it on to either my city councilor, who doesn't seem to be as excited about it, but there is an at-large councilor that seems to have taken an interest. And I'm making a point to just keep sending her everything. It's not, but her she actually said she would speak to the Department of Health. And so she mentioned his name to me when I went to pick up, back when we were all getting free COVID tests, I went to pick up my COVID test, and he was there, and I asked him, and he said, I'm not opposed to considering something else, but you must tell me what that is. And I don't have the answer for him. That you gave us a few ideas. He wants to know what else he can use instead.
So, yeah, again, it's always a little tricky because I don't want to make it sound like I'm being difficult. I do always want to reinforce with people that is not necessary, if they want to look at the data. It's not like any place that has given it up had to have some alternative in mind, because 8 years ago we didn't have these bait stations on every corner and our rat problem was lower too. So, but Arlington, but you can look at other places like Somerville, the strategies I talked with that Somerville had. I'm glad to send some of these ideas if you want to follow up with me. And it's on, they did the contrapest pilot. They did the rat-resistant trash toters. They did the dumpster licensing. Here in Arlington, where we did ban it, I'd like to say, for one, we banned it on the public lands. At the time, we weren't even using it on public lands. So some people were like, well, why do you want to pass a public lands ban if you're not using it? And it was like, well, one, we have in the past, I think, and we probably will in the future unless we codify a ban. But two, I think it's just good for a precedent to be like, you can ban this and it's not going to be the end of the world. So when we banned it, we weren't actually even using SCARs, and a lot of municipalities are not. So I just want to, you might want to point that out to your city councilor. There are a lot of municipalities that are not using SCARs, not that they have a ban in effect, but they're just not. Like Newton, which also passed a public lands ban, they're like, we haven't used SCARs in several years. It's because we didn't find it effective. So you might want to, say that, but the places that both have done the bans, Arlington and Newton and other cities, they're doing these contrapest pilots, and they're doing the electric snap box, and they're doing the dumpster bin, the dumpster licensing. So there's a lot of things that they can do from different kind of integrated pest management approaches. And I do want to just stress that IPM doesn't always mean poison-free. It means, poisons are at the back of the tool, as a thing you use. And I also want to say not a single ban does not allow SCARs. I don't know if I personally agree with this, but they almost all have an exception if there's a public health emergency. Say they've used everything else. In the Board of Health. Yeah. Yeah. For Arlington, the Board of Health has the option if there's a public health emergency where we're getting Ratmageddon and nothing else is working, where we could try SCARs again. So sometimes I feel I don't know if officials realize this, or sometimes if they don't know the public realizes this, but it's important to say it's not like we're completely saying this is never an option again if there's if we need it. But we're saying this is not working. We didn't use this, I'm sure if you look 10 or 12 years ago, Salem was not using SCARs, and, they're probably, the rodent populations were lower, if anything. And that's not just because of that. but it does show some compelling evidence that they could go without eschars. But, you know, there's enough information out there to share with him. To me, sometimes, and it doesn't sound like it's that person that you're talking to, but I do sometimes feel like sometimes when they say that, they're really trying to just, you know, get away from it, say, yeah, find me an alternative. Because it's like, well, but the thing you're asking for an alternative for doesn't even show to have any proof in using this. So, there are many other things we could try to use. Yeah. And Raptors Are the Solution has a lot of stuff on their site too.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in internet on the acronym cracks me up. It's Raptors Are the Solution, but their acronym is RATS, which cracks me up. Yeah, but anyway, the RATS website and theirs and Mass Audubon's, like we all have a lot of info out there that you could just look up or print or, you know.
And I'm sure, like, I mean, I would be willing to have a discussion with any city councilor. I'm sure Mass Audubon would, who is considering this. I'm glad to have discussions with anybody if you'd like to do an introduction and if they're open to it. Mm-hmm. I know we're past time, so I'm glad to just stop too, because it's getting late, but thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.